Welcome back, friends, to our study in the progress of redemption. We're taking you through the outline of the Old Testament that's given to us in Matthew 1:17. It says there's 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations from David to the Babylonian captivity, and 14 generations from the Babylonian captivity to Christ. And in scene one, which is this time between Abraham and David, God is doing a specific thing. He is making a great nation. Join me in this study about God making a great nation. Friends, this is what God's been doing. We're taking you through scene one in 10 steps, and I've already done 4 of the steps. The first 4 steps were, first, God raised up the founding fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then he gave us the 12 sons of Israel. These are they're going to become tribes, and they're the organizing method by God that God is using to build the nation of Israel. When they get into the land, it would be like having 12 states. And then when they got to Egypt, they multiplied. That was step 3, how they multiplied in Egypt. And so we could see from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God was making progress towards making his nation. When they got in Egypt and they multiplied, they became many. That's how many people you need for a nation, is you need a lot of people to go and found a nation. And then God had to do something else. He had to raise up a leader. So we have a theocratic leader in the man Moses. And that brings us to this next part. And this is exciting for any of you who like war movies. This is a war, because here is one nation stuck in another nation, being oppressed, enslaved, and God was going to come in and make war on Egypt so that he could deliver his people. That's the 5th step, deliverance. How was God going to deliver his people? The Egyptians opposed them and oppressed them because God made a prophecy. God said in Genesis chapter 15, I'm going to take your people and I'm going to bring them into the land of Egypt, and they would be oppressed there for 400 years. And then I would come with great signs and wonders to deliver my people. And so God did that. God took his people. And now notice that. God says, my people, oh my people, in Genesis 15. God always keeps his promises to his people. So when Moses came to Pharaoh, he said, let my people go. That was God's message. Think about that now. All those people were God's people. Let my people go. And you'll see all the way through the Old Testament that God is going to say, my people. My people. Israel is his people. They are the covenant people of God. And so whether he was blessing them or whether he was disciplining him, even up to the point when he took the nation away from them, he called them my people. This is very interesting. So God sent 10 plagues, but I really want to focus on the last one. The last one was what's called Passover. That's the important one, because in the Passover, it was not only a judgment on Egypt, but it was a way to teach us salvation. The Passover became such an important thing. So here were the people of God, and they had to stay home on a particular night because the death angel was going to pass over. Exodus 12:11-13 says this, now you shall eat in this manner, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live, and when I see the blood I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So here God was doing something very specific when he told his people what to do, to take a lamb, and then there would be a point when they sacrificed them, killed the lamb, and put the blood over the door. When the death angel came over and he saw the blood, he passed over that home and he saved those people. This is important for us to understand because there is no remission of sins without the shedding of blood. So although this was a judgment, it was also a picture of salvation. So God was going to take this lamb as a sacrifice, who would be a substitute for us. The lamb would shed his blood so that we might be saved. That's an interesting picture. It brings us all the way into the New Testament. But you have to remember something. There's a principle here that God uses for all of history. And the principle is this: if you bless Israel, you'll be blessed. But if you curse Israel, you will be cursed. And what was happening with Egypt? Egypt was being cursed because they cursed God's people, Israel. And so God was fulfilling his promises once again. And then God did something else. He instituted 7 feasts of the Lord that serve as a timeline of history and redemption. So God was going to take Moses and teach him these feasts. And the first feast is the Feast of Passover. So I bring that down to us. What does that mean for us today? Well, in 1 Corinthians 5, 7 and 8, it says this: clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Christ our Passover has been sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast, not with old leaven, not with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and in truth. In the book of Exodus, God says 21 times, "Oh my people, oh my people." So in other words, God was saving his people based on the principle that he established of shedding blood from a substitute, a lamb that would stand in your place, and that blood would receive the judgment of God. So that sacrifice, receiving the judgment of God, was going to come so that you might be saved. In other words, this is what Jesus is doing. That's why we call Jesus our Passover sacrifice. So Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. Why? For the same very thing, so that he might save us, that he might give us a righteousness not our own, the righteousness which comes from him. And so that was the sacrifice which God did. And he also said this was unleavened bread. What that means is that we usually put yeast in the bread. And when you put yeast in the bread, it gets big. You know, big Italian bread, really good. Probably everybody had Easter bread, and that's really fluffy and good. Well, that's because there was yeast in the bread. But unleavened bread has no yeast, no leaven in it. Why? It's a picture of sin. God uses it as a picture of sin. So when I take the leaven out of the bread, of course the bread's going to be flat. It doesn't rise. And then you cook it and you eat it. That's a picture to say this is going to be without sin. And so it's interesting that Jesus says of us in 1 Corinthians 5 that you are unleavened. What does that mean? God took away all of your sin as a believer. Isn't that exciting? God gave that promise to his people, Israel, the Hebrews, as they were coming out of Egypt. And they were going to begin, they were becoming a great nation. Why? Because they were now being taught to understand what it meant to be in a relationship with the living God. And so I think that when my kids were growing up, my firstborn, Nathan, he was running towards the stove one day, and Renee had something on the stove, my wife had something on the stove, and was cooking. And so he was going to touch the top of the stove. In other words, there was fire there, right? Because something was on, it was cooking. And when you're 2 or 3 years old, what do you do as a parent? You want to protect your child. You want to stop them from doing what they're going to do, okay? Why? Because they need direction. They need instruction. This is what God is doing here. Israel is a child. Israel's very young. So they're like the little toddler running over to the stove to touch the stove. Now, how ridiculous would it be for me to take my son, who's 30 years old now, and as he's walking towards the stove, to go, "Stop! Don't," and run over there and stop him? Well, that would be ridiculous. Why? He's older. He doesn't need that type of instruction. He doesn't need that type of direction. Understand this, that direction, that instruction that Israel is getting is to help them grow up and mature, to understand their salvation, to understand the promises that God gave them. And so they're very young at this time, and God is saying to them, I don't want sin in your life. That's why I want you to eat unleavened bread. Listen to what John 5 says. It says this in verses 45 through 47. Do not think that I will accuse you before the Father. The one who accuses you is Moses, in whom you have set your hope. For if you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? In other words, when we go back to the Old Testament, we go back to Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, who are we seeing? We're seeing Jesus. And Jesus is making a very important point, 3 points here that I think are instructive for us and why we need to learn about the deliverance, what God was doing there. These 10 steps are important because they're a way to teach us how Jesus works with us. And he was actually in those passages of Scripture. Jesus is our Passover. That lamb was representative of what Jesus was going to do, that his blood is over your house. And so when I think of what Jesus said here, this is the importance of reading all of these books for yourself. First, if you believe Moses, you'll believe me. So Jesus makes this direct correlation, okay? If you believe Moses, you're going to believe me. Second, if you don't believe Moses, you won't believe Jesus. Now, there's a lot of Christians today who are teaching, you don't need Moses, you don't need the Old Testament, you don't need to understand Leviticus, you don't need to understand Numbers. That's all false. That's all a lie from Satan. You have to go back. This is the eternal Word of the living God. This Word of God is not going away, okay? It has the nature of God. It's eternal. And so the third thing that's important about this passage is that Moses wrote about Jesus. Who do we see? Who is delivering the Hebrews from the Egyptians? Jesus. Jesus is there. And so when you read these texts, you got to look for him because he's there. Jesus said, Moses wrote about me. He's all over these texts. So that's what we learn about from the deliverance. We need to remember what God did at Passover. This last week was Passover week. And so we need to remember that when Jesus died on the cross, he had a Passover meal with his disciples, and then he died on the cross as the fulfillment of Passover and the fulfillment of the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the fulfillment of the Feast of First Fruits. All then doing what he was teaching right here because it was all about Jesus. And so the next step in our deliverance is that we need to understand that Egypt's sin was full. In other words, when does God come and punish a nation and bring his punishment on a nation, his judgment on a nation? Well, God is going to do that when the sin is full. This is what he promised to Abraham in Genesis 15. I won't do this until their sin is full. The sin of the Amorite is full. The sin of the Egyptians was full. So the judgment of Egypt was for their way of life, their laws, their customs, their culture. All of their culture, their customs, their laws were teaching you to sin and to do evil. And so there was nothing good about their culture, not one thing, because all of it was centered around an idolatry of worshiping many gods. So God, our God, was coming, who's the true God, was coming to fight against their gods and to show you that they're powerless, they're nothing, they're idols. And so Leviticus 18, 1 through 5 says something very important, and it's one of the instructive things for us to learn ourselves. It says this: the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel, say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do what is done in the land of Egypt where you lived, nor are you to do what is done in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You are to perform my judgments and keep my statutes, to live in accord with them. I am the Lord your God. So you shall keep my statutes and my judgments, by which a man may live if he does them. I am the Lord. Now, I think this is a very important passage of Scripture. Why? Because God is bringing up something very important. He's bringing up, how do I judge a nation? I will judge the nation when they take their laws, their customs, their statutes are against the living God. And they're in four different things. Four things that they will produce in their laws and their customs that will bring the mighty hand of God down. Four things. One, immorality. They will teach you that it's okay to have sex outside of marriage. And sometimes that sex outside of marriage will go beyond bounds you've ever thought, okay? Even with animals. And God says, I don't want any of that, all right? Second, idolatry. They will worship false gods. And sometimes in the worship of those false gods, the idolatry gets really bad where they kill innocent babies. They would take their babies and sacrifice them to their gods. And it's kind of amazing to me that a mother and a father could take a child and murder the child and worship to a deity that doesn't even exist. That is either a demon, it's a demonic, or they just make it up. Like the crocodile, worshiping a crocodile. Okay. You know, they worship the things of the creation rather than the creator. And then the last thing is Israel. How do you treat Israel? You're going to be judged for all of that. Those are the four issues that God used to judge Egypt, and those are the four issues he's going to use to judge the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Jebusites, all the termites that are in the land of Israel, that Israel's going to have to go and take all that land. They also sinned in these four ways against the living God. I really love Jeremiah chapter 12, and I'm going to get into this a little bit later in the series. But in Jeremiah chapter 12, the Lord comes to all of the neighbors of Israel, and he called them all my wicked neighbors. And he confronts them for causing his people to worship idols. And he said, what you should have done was follow their ways. Their ways. My people's ways. My people. You caused my people to go and worship idols. And he confronts them on that. And so there's a battle that goes on in your heart, Christian. And here's the battle. The battle is this. When you become a Christian, when you give your life to Christ, you are just like these Jews coming out of Egypt. You got a lot of the world in you. They had a lot of Egypt in them. And so when you grow in your faith, you got to get the world out of you. The world, the flesh, the devil, that's got to get out. They needed to get a lot of Egypt out of them, and they needed to download the truth, the ethics, the morals, the spirit, the relationship with the living God. That's what they needed to do. And so now, as I'm wrapping up this, I want to just kind of remind you of something that's very important in this scene. If God can deliver his people out of Egypt with 10 plagues, think about how he can deliver you. I don't know what you're facing today. Whatever your struggle is, the Lord our God is powerful in you to deliver you. That's why we say in like Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Thank you for being with me. Please give me a big thumbs up if you like the Bible study. Subscribe to it, and then share it with others. Thank you.